Hello, James Holland here. Now, before we start the podcast, I just want to tell you about my new TV series, Normandy 44, D-Day and the Battle for France, based on my book of the same name. This three-parter sees me and former US Special Forces officer Dr. Mike Simpson touring not only the invasion beaches, but the wider, deeper battlefield, and discussing the 77-day campaign in much greater detail than other docs do on this subject. So, in a nutshell, there's more chat, less repeating what's been happening in the previous 15 minutes, a fair bit of busting of myths, and, we hope, telling you stuff you as viewers haven't already heard 100 times before. It's going to be coming out in May, but we're looking to give 10 people an exclusive chance to see the series before anybody else and to review it for us. So, if you fancy a sneak preview, please do get in touch and we'll send you a time-limited link to the series. You can email us at info@typhoonpictures.co.uk. So that's info@typhoonpictures.co.uk. But don't worry if you're not one of the lucky 10. The series will be available to absolutely everybody in May. Thank you. And now here's Al and I chewing the World War II cud.
Who man, which is, of course, Geordie for Achtung, Achtung. You are
That's
listening
definitely
to
my favourite so far. Definitely.
You are listening to episode 92 of We Have Ways of Making You Talk podcast, nearly at the magic 100. Many thanks to Alex the Geordie, who got in touch with us on Twitter using the hashtag We Have Ways and said, here we go. Don't know how quickly you're running out of Achtung, Achtungs, but who man is the Geordie version. Apologies.
That's absolutely brilliant. That's absolutely brilliant.
Apologies to the entire Northeast.
That's fantastic. And actually, I've just been writing about the Durham Light Infantry.
Ah,
The most overused and abused infantry unit in the British Army in World War II, by my reckoning.
yes.
And actually,
Well, Dan,
there isn't a DLI memorial in. I want a big statue somewhere and put it in Consett or somewhere like that up in Durham. So I think we should raise some money and make it happen.
Dan Jackson's book, The Northumbrians, there's a lot about the DLI in that, and about how you have the martial tradition of the border reivers and everything that then mutates, and also via coal mining. So it's a tough area, and so the DLI get this reputation for being super tough fighting men, and then get used everywhere as a result.
Yeah, I remember in 2014 when it was the what would that have been 70th anniversary of D-Day. I remember on the evening at Café Gondray, Arlette Gondray's little cafe. She was sort of getting out the champagne and stuff, and there were various sort of dignitaries there and veterans and stuff. And there was this guy sat in the corner with kind of really old, roomy eyes, little silvery tash, loads of medals on his blazer and a beret on, and no one was talking to him. And I went over and talked to him. He'd been in the DLI, and I said, "Oh God, you're obviously here in Normandy." He went, "Yeah, and just about every bloody other place as well." God, you name it, he'd done it. He'd got there. He'd been all the way through North Africa. He'd been Sicily, southern Italy, D-Day, all the way through to the end of the war. Absolutely amazing.
Brilliant.
Anyway, so
Brilliant.
happy to have the Geordie there.
We've got to have the Geordie. And at the risk of wasting another variant, Matt Baker, I'm not sure that's the one show's Matt Baker, also got in touch.
Matt Baker
got in touch with the vital question. Is there an argument for now then to be the Yorkshire equivalent of Achtung, Achtung? Well, certainly if you heard someone saying now then, you'd be running away, wouldn't you? Of course, the forbidden words. How's about that then? And of course, the truth is that as we launch into episode 92 of this crazy runaway train, yes, we are running low on language options at We Have Ways. If anyone speaks Bikya or Patwin, do please get in touch. I seem to have mislaid my German Bikya dictionary.
Yeah, and if the gentleman who speaks Bikya does get in touch, it will be newsworthy. Because there's only one of him, apparently.
There's only one of him. It's one of the
only
languages
one Bikya speaker in the whole planet.
The fight back starts here for Bikya. He may well be a fan, James. Do not underestimate the reach of the podcast. Now, talking about reach, how about this? Neil Tompkins got in touch via email. Dear James and Al, I think I've caught all the podcasts to date. I listen in bed to fall asleep, so I might have missed some topics. Although this has led to some very strange dreams. As a 50-something, snap, I grew up reading battle and warlord comics in the late 70s and early 80s. We were immersed in tales of daring do. Union Jack Jackson, anyone? He was a sort of, I remember him.
Battle of Britain.
Battle of Britain. I mean, I've got some warlords in the downstairs loo here, to be honest. The big fat compilations of them.
Yeah,
Is
nice.
it worth discussing how the depiction of the Second World War has changed from the immediate war years through the 60s, 70s, and 80s? Action man escape from cold its set and so on to the current day, and are the cultural changes in how World War II is depicted changing as the conflict passes from living memory? The conflict is now history, whereas when I was a boy it was something that Grandad took part in. Anyhow, I'm thoroughly enjoying the podcast, although its use as post-coital entertainment is currently in dispute. Kind regards, Neil. Well, I mean,
I think that's a really cracking question, isn't it?
Well, I mean, to be honest, for me, it kind of comes to the nub of it, really. I mean,
yes,
I think I definitely fit that profile of someone who grew up in the 70s. I'm in my early 50s, you know, on Action Man, Airfix, the whole thing, and it's worth bearing in mind that during the time I grew up, the most popular sitcom in the country was Dad's Army. You know, like a, and then It Ain't Half Hot Mum. 2 programs looking back at the war, like nostalgically, but laughing at it and being irreverent about it as well, but also celebrating, you know, particularly Dad's Army, celebrating the Home Guard, which is like such an important part of total war. You know, the civilian population being expected to fix bayonets if it came to it, and all that sort of thing. It is really interesting. And then you get, I think that you get this sort of, there's an interesting shift as well in the 90s where it stops being, in American movies, for instance, it stops being sort of action movie fodder or entertainment fodder. And you get this very serious gear change via Saving Private Ryan, thanks to Stephen Ambrose and Band of Brothers and this sort of Greatest Generation thing, and taking it all really actually quite seriously.
Yeah. I mean, do you remember Privates on Parade? I mean, all those amazing.
Of course,
books.
you see.
You got Terry Thomas sort of going, Glasgow.
Yeah,
and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it's just amazing.
The sort of irreverence that you kind of have here. That I mean, I don't know. I mean, to be honest, this is a thing that that is probably even a separate podcast, separate from a podcast about the Second World War.
Okay, here's my take on this.
It's a podcast about the cultural digestion of the Second World War.
Well, our friend Guy Walters was thinking about doing a whole book about this, about how the war's been, how we view the Second World War and how that has changed. And he thinks it's changed substantially. I mean, it's very interesting that in the 1950s, whoever was then Chief of the Air Staff said, we should really just stop all this kind of Battle of Britain commemoration. I mean, it's all just sort of nostalgic nonsense. That was in the late 1950s. It's all a bit embarrassing now. I mean, what's really interesting, if you look at all the films in the 1950s and just the very start of the 60s, so late 40s, 50s and 60s, early 60s, they're all very kind of triumphalist. Britain's a brilliant, harnessing engineering and industry from brilliant machines, whether they be mosquitoes flying low over, Norwegian Fords or whatever, or the dam busters, etc., etc. It's all that kind of stuff, and it's very kind of gung-ho. And you know what? We're freaking brilliant. And then, of course, there is that massive shift, and that's what we were talking with Dan Tobin a little bit about the declinist view and the fact that that's all tied up with post-empire guilt and decline of Britain as a great power and all the rest of it. Then you get the kind of, you're right, but in the Commando comics, it's still, Sergeant Tom Sibley, had been in with the Ayrshires for 3 long years, and he was fed up with war, and it's all that kind of stuff. But all those comics, I mean, one thing I would say about all those comics is, in terms of the sketching, the actual images, the attention to detail is absolutely spot on. You cannot fault it. I mean, their historical detail is brilliant. So there is this massive shift, and now we have become, I think, much more kind of sort of mawkish. I mean. And that is also tied up with the fact that generation which was just there is now almost not. So, I'm not much younger than you, Al. And I do remember my mum sort of going, that's far too much butter on your toast. In the war, ... and all this kind of stuff.
Bananas.
Endlessly
no bananas.
Banging on
no
and
bloody
on about
bananas.
Rationing, God's sake.
Yeah, and my mum had to eat the pet rabbit, or at least the pet rabbit disappeared.
Well, my mum had to eat their pet pig down in Cornwall, and she always tells this great story of, and it was called Pigoy. So it even had a name, which is, as you know, is fatal. And she said, I can distinctly remember sobbing as I was eating Pigoy, but at the same time thinking he was really delicious.
Well, there you go. That encapsulates the United Kingdom's relationship to the Second World War. It was a terrible thing, but it was delicious.
Yes, exactly. But I do think, and we were talking about this actually the other day, weren't we, with regard to Spike Milligan? And I think one of the things that Britain has always had a sense of humour about the Second World War. And I was reading this hilarious thing. This account by, I think I've read one of the extracts from Farley Mowat over at Christmas. Yeah. And there's this brilliant bit where he lands on the beaches in southern Sicily. And his commander, he's this enormous kind of sort of giant of a man called Alex Campbell, sort of yelling at him, and feels he's yelling at him personally to storm this hill just off the beach where there's a house and Italians are firing. And he runs forward, and he's panting and he's sort of slightly in the zone. He doesn't know what's going on. And suddenly they come to some wire and he thinks, right, we've got to get through it. So he tells all his men, he goes, fix bayonets, charge that hill. And they kind of jump over the wire, tearing their uniform and shorts and legs and stuff, get to the top of the thing. And all the time he's sort of going, yeah, charging with his bayonet, but at the same time thinking, why aren't the Italians fighting back? And he gets there's a bunch of British commandos who've attacked the same hill 5 minutes earlier from the other side and already captured it. And the British commander goes up to him and goes, cool, that was brilliant, love seeing that. That was like Charge of the Light Brigade. I haven't seen that since the last Errol Flynn flick. And and it's really funny because when you're looking at German accounts, it's sort of we received orders, and then I told my Panzer division to get into gear, and we went forward, and we engaged the enemy. When you read the Italian accounts, it's sort of I glanced across at my men with their beating hearts, so proud, doing their bit for for Italia. I wondered how many would be kind of lying dead. What would their mothers be thinking then by this evening? Blah 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 blah. Yeah. And then you have the Americans, and it's all kind of, I think it's incredibly straight, and not much humour, but quite gung ho. So you have these sort of massive 4 different sort of cultural takes. Yeah. On basically the same thing, which are all massively different, and it's just fascinating.
Yeah. Now, God, I have a question
we've
for
ranged
you.
Quite a long way from that.
Yes, I have a question for you. Loving the podcast.
Thanks.
Loving the podcast.
Can you send me an email because you're over 50?
No, no way. Loving the podcast. Last week, it's gone out the day we're recording. So the second part of our Daniel Todman podcast. Yes. And we talked with Daniel about economic power, and this is something that really struck me because we talked about the tungsten price manipulation thing, right? Which I just love. I think it's so interesting, and it's so interesting that, of course, it didn't have the desired effect. A thing he said was, of course, well, you can do that to the Germans if you want, but what are they going to do? Their economy's like not normal anyway. And you said, yes, of course, they'll just print some more money. Which brings me to a question, James Holland. Whenever we talk about the Second World War, you always say that the Germans do everything expensively. They do everything in a way that compared to the Allied way of doing things is uneconomic and inefficient. Well, to use your own words, just print some more money. What difference does it make?
Well, as you know, that if you do just print... Well, I don't think they did just print some more money. Because obviously, if you do just print lots of money, then you have this huge problem of massive inflation, which is what followed. Yeah. As I understand it, although my economics is not very good.
Well, which after all was the thing that the Nazis had very much styled themselves as one of the answers to, that they were not going to allow big inflation. Because there's like 2 or 3 pinch points before the war where their economy looks like it's going to suddenly overheat and slide back into inflation, and they have to pull back. Certainly during the rearmaments drive after 1935, and the 4-year plan and all that sort of thing, they very much get stuck in this thing of, oh shit, it's going to cause inflation. We can't have that happen again. Everyone, the massive inflation of the 20s was very much in people's minds still, But there's a war on now. We're now talking about like 1942, 1943, when their economy, You know,
So how they do it is, I don't think they do go around sort of printing vast amounts of money. Actually, I think what they do is they steal lots of money. So they have lots of bullion, for example.
Yes.
I mean, from the Greeks, infamously,
Yes.
which is why the Greeks are so pissed off with, when the Germans won't give them a loan and stuff a few years back. It all goes back to that. So they absolutely, completely fleece all the countries in which they've conquered. Just grind them dust, from France and everything. I mean, and all their gold reserves.
But not particularly efficiently, though. So they end up with this thing where, before the war, the European economy is the biggest single economic bloc, as it were, in the world. When it's just ticking over and being allowed to get on with trading normally. The Germans then, of course, the fall of France happens very quickly, and suddenly the Germans are going, wow, we're sat on this gold mine. We've got France now, we've got this massive industrial capacity in France and the lowlands and all that sort of thing. And then what proceeds to happen is they steal a load of stuff and crash all those economies.
Yes, because what the Germans don't sort of take into account is the reason why France is the kind of number one economy in Europe at the time, and is this very wealthy, comparatively industrialized nation, is because they do have lots of cars, and so their guys can get to work, which means their workforce is more efficient, which means they're earning more money, their productivity is up, so there's more money going in the coffers, and all the rest of it goes around. The problem is, if you go in and steal everything, then that workforce can't then work, because they don't have anything, and they don't have their cars and all the rest of it. And I think I've said that stat before about, they have the largest number of vehicles of any European nation on the 1st of January 1940, but by the 31st of December 1940, they've got 8% of what they had on the start of the year, because the Germans have half-inched it all.
And then what happens to the German economy as well is that they realise that in order to keep the war effort going, I mean, you have this really fascinating thing in 1941 where soldiers are given an armaments holiday because they're so concerned about skilled workers going to the Russian front. So they actually have this armaments holiday where guys would be given furlough out the army to go back to work in an armaments factory, build the weapons they were going to use to conquer Russia, and then rejoin their units and go to fight. And of course, that's all predicated on the idea that Barbarossa's going to only take 8 weeks or
3 months. They reckon
12 weeks, whatever. Yeah, and then you're going to go back to normal. Everyone's going to go back to their factories.
Exactly.
But of course, there just aren't enough people in Germany, so they're taking workers from all over, which then destroys the economies of the places they're taking workers from. So Europe goes from being, before September 1939, from being the richest economic part of the, economic block's the wrong word, because after all that leads us to, that sounds like the EU, but like the richest part of the world, full stop, to completely flatlining, basically within a year of
absolutely
of the fall of France.
You've got to ask yourself, why is Hitler so keen to go into the Soviet Union in June 1941? It's because
he's got to beat Britain.
Yes, but does that mean going into the Soviet Union? The reason it means going to the Soviet Union is because he's run out of resources.
Stuff.
They've been like kids in a sweet shop in all these, during the Blitzkrieg years. France, the Low Countries, Denmark, Norway, the Balkans. They just go in and they're like a plague of locusts and they just clean it out. And then it's gone. And it's gone forever because, all the economies of all those countries are absolutely screwed. So to find the food, to find the fuel, to find the resources that they so desperately need, because they can't get to the world's oceans. They don't have a large enough merchant fleet. They're being blockaded. They're stuck in the Baltic. They've got a very small bit of line. They're actually stuck in the middle of Europe. They simply cannot access the world's oceans, and therefore they cannot access the world's resources. So they've got to get them somewhere else. So that's why they go into the Soviet Union in June 1941, because if they don't, they're going to run out of everything. The whole point about going to the Soviet Union is to get those resources. And obviously fulfill their ideological aims as well. But that's
also why it has to be a quick 12-week campaign.
Of course,
they can't get stuck into anything longer because
they
know. I mean, one of the other things that I find really, really interesting is as part of this picture of the German economy, the German imperial, the Reich economy, the Greater Reich economy, is that the French have all these aircraft factories, and the Germans obviously think, right, we've got our hands on their aircraft factories. We're going to be churning out whatever we want in France. And it doesn't happen. And there's
in
this
total, 7,300.
Yeah.
In total.
Yeah. And at one point, there's 1 month where the Germans are churning out however many thousands of aircraft, and they get like 140 out of all of France because they just can't make it work. And the French are either literally sabotaging, chucking their sabots into the machines or whatever, but they just can't get it going. And after all, they've pinched all the skilled labour. That it's this incredibly short-sighted thing where they think, well, that country's rich, rather than let's keep it rich and benefit from the mutual wealth that will generate.
Imagine if they treated France well. It could have really, it didn't steal all their vehicles. That they actually said, okay, we're just going to let you run, and it'd be great. We're going to pay all your workforce, and Jesus, it would have been so much more better for them. But thank God they didn't.
But they did, relatively speaking, treat France very well. You compare it to what's going on in the greater government. You compare it to what's going on in the Watergau. What they're not, and there is this strange gradation in the Reich as well, in the Greater Reich of states that they treat reasonably well. For instance, the Denmark is essentially left intact.
Yes.
Politically, and its civil service is left intact, which is Tim Snyder's argument about why the Holocaust doesn't happen in Denmark, because Denmark is left legally intact as an entity, whereas what happens
so it can get its Jews out of there.
Yeah, and it has control of itself. Whereas in Poland, what happens is they create failed states. They collapse the Polish state, and the Polish state in the east of Poland collapses at least twice, because the Russians come in, collapse it, and the Germans seize it, collapse it, and there's literally none of the sort of tent poles of a normal state legally exist anymore. And so you've got this across the Reich, you've got this gradation of France, which is treated kind of as at least an industrial society, and at least one that has culture and art of its own, that's to be kind of to a certain extent enjoyed and encouraged, which is quite interesting. And then Poland, which is, when we get the chance, once we've killed, basically what happens
once we've killed everyone.
Well, once we've killed all the Jews, then we'll starve everyone else to submission, and we'll starve the Ukraine out, and we'll starve Belarus.
Well, we've sort of touched on the hunger plan before, but the other thing is why do you think every time they're sort of gassing people, gassing Jews and so on, why do you think they're kind of pulling out all their teeth? It's because they need the money. They need the gold. Yeah. So they are this gold is being melted down. It's being pulled out of the teeth, put into a big sack, put on a train, sent to Berlin. There's various foundries where these gold teeth and others are, and rings and all the rest of it are all sent, and they are literally all melted down. It's absolutely amazing. And that's because their economy is so rotten. And then, of course, you've got Operation Bernhard, which is a plan to undermine the British economy by printing lots of British banknotes. But the British get on top of that very, very quickly. And in the end, Kaltenbrunner, who takes over from Heydrich as the head of the Reich Intelligence Service, he basically just starts using it himself. And setting it up and just using it for his own purposes and for his own little intriguing and all the rest of it. It never works as a kind of but they're printing lots of money, but it's British money.
Incredible. Well, okay, it's time for a short break, but before we do, I just want to pose a fascinating question from one of our listeners, William Chambers, who DM'd us at our new podcast Twitter handle @WeHaveWaysPod. William asks, James, right, okay, I'm in the clear on this one then. James, your claim about wartime evacuations by sea always being successful got me wondering about the Germans trying to get home across the Baltic, or the British wishing they could get away from Singapore, which begs the question, did the British have to surrender to the Japanese when they did? Whoa, well, an absolute cracker, William. James, we demand an answer. We'll take a break now. He's going to have a think. Welcome back to We Have Ways. Now, we're the first to admit when we get something wrong, and I'd like to kick off this part of the pod with a strong sense of humility. As you may know, we got our metaphorical knickers in a twist recently about World War II themed pubs. One or two of them we questioned, wondering if they did in fact have anything to do with the war. Well, Richard D got in touch rather forcibly via Twitter. He said, James, quick to rubbish the inclusion of the Shiny Chef on the World War II themed pub list, but HMS Sheffield was a light cruiser that pursued the Bismarck and covered Arctic convoys that was nicknamed the Shiny Chef.
Yeah, well, so the Mea Culpa,
Yeah, another one we called into question was the Bells of Peover. JP got in touch to remind us, love the podcast. Read the Bells of Piover. Patton was billeted in nearby Piover Hall, and in the run-up to D-Day, met with Eisenhower at the Bells of Piover, which is still
I really love this pub.
The
I
US
really
flag.
like this pub. My name's Patton. I've got a really high squeaky voice.
Could I have a Harford mild, please? And some potato chips.
And if you don't give me them, I'm going to shoot you with my pull-handled revolver.
Have you got any? Is there a barman I can slap? Right, okay.
And do up your top button and straighten your tie.
So,
Yes.
James, this Singapore question, assume we
There
know
was never a
nothing.
plan to evacuate. So, had they done, who knows, it might have been successful. But there weren't enough ships there, and not helped by the fact that two of our battleships got the Prince of Wales and I can't remember the other one off the top of my head.
Hood.
No, not the Hood. No,
The Hood.
it's Prince of Wales and another one got sunk just beforehand. So that wasn't good. The problem with the whole Singapore thing is just everyone was just completely caught short. No one was expecting to have to come up against the Japanese in these circumstances in the way they did in early part of 1942. And the tactics that we used against them were too piecemeal. So we had on paper, we had quite a large army there, quite a number of forces there. But they were very polyglot, they were very mixed, they were undertrained and poorly equipped. And everyone had kind of underestimated the capabilities of the Japanese. No one expected this kind of, this incredibly fast-moving...
Churchill also didn't know what was at Singapore.
No.
He literally thought it was a fortress, and had convinced himself it was a fortress because he hadn't been paying attention.
I think that's true.
Because in the 30s, in the 20s and the 30s, the British government keeps committing to reinforce and rebuild the base at Singapore and then putting it off. And they put it off, they put it off, they put it off. So it's never actually the thing that people assume it.
Yes.
At the time assumed it was. And it's not necessarily a defensible position. It's classic British Army. This opening phase of an encounter with a new enemy, you get completely caught with your trousers down. You've no idea how they operate tactically. You've probably got soldiers from all over the world who haven't all had the same training, who are from different bits. Some of them don't even know why they're there. One of the interesting things that the British Army has a recurring problem with in the Far East is their soldiers don't really know why they're there.
And it's a really mixed force of troops there. I mean, obviously there are some Brits there, but there's some Aussies there. There's loads of Indian troops as well. It's a real mixed bag. And as I say, they're just not well trained. They haven't really thought about jungle trading. And the problem is they get caught out in penny packets. So they're constantly trying to kind of sort of meet the flood. And so they get caught off in isolation where they are completely outnumbered. So overall, General Yamashita's only got kind of 36,000 troops against, 80,000 Brits or whatever.
Yeah.
But at the point of impact, he's massively superior in every single time. And there are moments where there is kind of sort of some quite brave fighting and all the rest of it. I mean, for example, I remember going to one of the gun positions last year on Singapore Island, and the guns were all facing south. But the Japanese were attacking from the north, so they're all facing the wrong way. Yeah. And so, it was potentially quite a powerful kind of gun battery there, but it couldn't really be used because they weren't in the right direction. Because they're there to kind of see off any kind of naval threat.
But what you've just described there, overwhelming application of force, that's Falgelb. That's
of course,
the Ardennes.
The similarities are legion. They just are legion. Time and time again, if you look at the Imperial Japanese in World War II, particularly at the start, and then you look at Germany, it's the same thing. Not very successful economies, haven't got enough stuff, quite impressive kit at the beginning of the war, but sort of getting a little bit obsolescent by the end, all this kind of stuff.
And super motivated. Politically motivated, militarily motivated, very clear objectives, and using the army as a weapon really effectively. But just as the British get caught with their trousers down, go away, figure it out, takes them a year or two to go, hang on a minute, and have a massive shakedown and a refigure, find the right people to do the leading. The Japanese and the Germans end up overextended massively,
and peaking too soon.
Unable,
too soon. I mean, in the case of the Germans.
You
have these. I mean, the Japanese air forces, whether they be naval air forces or army air forces, are absolutely stupendous in terms of kind of quality. overall, per man, they're in a different league to literally anyone else. I mean, if you're a new pilot, a naval pilot, and you're going to be a Zero fighter, for example, in your Zero, you would have 500 hours in your logbook before you start. That's at the start of the war, when everyone else is sort of, thinks 150, 175 is plenty. So they're just in a different league. But the problem is, of course, is the attrition rates are high because, operating from an aircraft carrier is incredibly tough and difficult. And actually, that just reminds me about the film Midway, which I've just seen. But once you start to attrit these incredibly good naval forces, these naval pilots, there's no way to replace them because they haven't got the resources, the time, the capacity to train them up to that same level. So suddenly there's this huge qualitative and quantitative drop-off that they can't keep up with, while the Americans are doing exactly the opposite.
But also, if you think about Midway, there's a different kind of attrition in naval air power, isn't there? Because if you sink the aircraft carrier, you've attrited the entire thing.
Yes.
Whereas if you bomb, say Battle of Britain, if you bomb Manston, right, they fill in the crater.
Yeah.
And they fly new Spitfires in from 12 group, or from 13 group. Whereas if you sink an aircraft carrier,
they've gone.
It's this sort of very final form of attrition.
And there is,
the Japanese have no industrial answer.
Exactly, and there's that amazing 7 minutes at Midway, where at 10:20 a.m. on the 4th of June 1942, America is losing the Battle of Midway and by association probably the war in the Pacific. And 7 minutes later, with three of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers burning and wrecked and sinking, they're winning it. I mean, it is just absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah.
And obviously, with those aircraft carriers going down, as you say, that's a whole load of pilots that are going down as well, that are super trained, super motivated, super brilliant, and they've gone. And they are literally irreplaceable. So,
yeah. But Singapore,
yeah.
We've done it again.
Yeah. Well, Singapore, it's not a good moment by any stretch of the imagination. But the other thing, of course, is that people are willing to surrender because, back at the end of the First World War, the Japanese have been very generous to their prisoners. They hadn't gone into this kind of ultra nationalistic kind of sort of quasi shogun kind of weird honor code thing.
Yeah.
And so they treated prisoners pretty well. And I think no one was expecting the barbarity that the Japanese imposed on POWs. No. And so you might have fought on a little bit harder if you'd known that was what was coming. I mean, but yeah, it's a bad business.
That's certainly then what that. But that message, doesn't quite get through for quite a while, doesn't it? Because the British really can't make anything stick until 43 and until. That after the Arakan offensives and all that sort of stuff.
No, I know, and I think but also what one has to consider is that even Britain, which is the kind of sort of premier global trading nation in the world in 1939, has suffered in the Great Depression that has hit the world at the end of the 1920s and beginning of the 1930s, and its global reach is absolutely astonishing, and the cost of keeping all these places not only armed and equipped but up to speed is just absolutely enormous. And obviously from September 1939 onwards, we've got our attention on matters that are closer to home. So if Singapore is kind of considered a kind of sort of a bit of a kind of military backwater, it's hardly surprising, frankly. It's just, you've lost your army at Dunkirk. You've got to create this new army. You've got to build lots of new aircraft. You've got to kind of keep the Navy on thing. You've got to absolutely deal with the most pressing threat, which is keep North Africa and the Mediterranean and all that, and so on. And that is where your attention is. And there is there's a perception, albeit clearly a politically naive one, that America, which is not in the war at this time, has sort of got the eyes on the whole Far East thing and with Japan, and sort of got it under control because America is Japan's biggest supplier. It is his big supplier of oil, of steel, of many other resources, and it sort of seems to be all in hand. I mean, it seems crazy that the Japanese, as they're trying to sort of emerge into the modern world, would take on the United States. So, so in retrospect, it seems naive, but at the time, you can see how that thought process happens.
The thing is, though, after all, the Japanese do. I'm going to use an expression I loathe. They do reach out to America, don't they, to say, "Hey, can we talk about this?" And Roosevelt's not interested. And arguably, that's the big what if moment. Actually, the biggest what if moment in American-Japanese relations, isn't it? Is that then Sakurai's deposed, Tojo comes in. And
it's not Sakurai, it's Kono.
Kono
Kono is the Prime Minister.
So, it's Kono, it's not Sakurai.
You've been reading about him in Burma 44, Al. That's Sakurai.
Yeah. Yes, I have been doing your audiobooks.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Like being inside your head.
Very
Anyway,
well.
that's it for today. Thanks for listening as always. And extra thanks to everyone who got in touch via Twitter and email. We may not be ideal listening post-coitally, but there are a number of scenarios in which hearing James dismiss the career of James Gavin is entirely appropriate.
No, I'm rehabilitating him.
Questions,
I'm rehabilitating him in
comments.
Sicily.
Oh, you're working it back, are you?
Yeah.
Questions, comments, grievances by Twitter using the hashtag WeHaveWays and also @WeHaveWaysPod. The email address is WeHaveWaysPodcast@gmail.com for people at risk of the coronavirus. But we're the lads.
Cheerio.